Good evening and welcome to New Foundation Unity. Tonight we're starting a new series on Unity history, the inside story. Even if you are somewhat familiar with the history of Unity, I think that this is a unique insight. You will find some unique insights as we go through the development of consciousness that was the foundation of this global healing ministry. There are handouts for this course. They are awesome handouts, and these are not all things that I can put on the website. Some are, but if you are interested in handouts, and after we have our opening prayer, I'll tell you what some of them are. You can email me to send them, and but you should include some postage. All right? And so as we begin our time together, I invite you to close your eyes for a moment. Be still. Be still and know. Be still and know that I am. I am that secret name that was given to Moses, that is the God consciousness within us. Recognize that Christ know the truth that wherever you are, that source of infinite good is with you. One source, one infinite source, one power, one presence, one life, one mind. And we are one with that one. And so for a few minutes, moments in the silence, let us rest in that consciousness of oneness, oneness with God, oneness with all life in the silence. I have free and open access to God's infinite storehouse of good. And now, as we begin to return our attention to this time and this place, we give thanks that the source is within us, that we have guidance in every moment, abundance of everything necessary, healing energy, peace of mind. God's will for us is absolute good. And in that awareness, we do give thanks in the name and through the power of that living, loving Christ presence within us all. Amen. That was the syllabus that I handed out. And I would just, since most of you, I assume, don't have it, I'm not sure that it got on either my website or Mark's website, although I've been working on it. And I would like to read to you the course objective. Number 1, to inspire students with the history of unity, both through learning about significant events and the development of consciousness that preceded these events. In other words, this is more than just a facts, names, dates kind of thing. 2, to revitalize the unity movement today through the practice of silence and affirmative prayer, metaphysical study of the Bible, and the use of covenants. These are the spiritual practices that the Fillmores used that produced that global healing ministry. I have also a suggested reading list, and number 1 I have listed is James Dillard Freeman's The Story of Unity. Very easy read. He actually knew the Fillmores and worked with them. Neil Valla, an historian who has written a biography of Myrtle called Torchbearer to Light the Way. It's just been reprinted. He's also written a biography of Charles Fillmore, The Spiritual Journey of Charles Fillmore. He's written one on the Unity Movement. And then one that I will quote from tonight, Tom Witherspoon, another biography of Myrtle Fillmore, Mother of Unity. And of course, Myrtle Fillmore's healing letters, these are selected letters, and as you may know, she wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters personally in the beginning, before it got so overwhelming that she couldn't anymore, but she would respond to all who wrote letters in the beginning. Now today, this evening is an introduction. Catching the vision. We're going to have some biological material of both Myrtle and Charles. The spirit with which they entered into probably the greatest vision of a healing ministry, the like of which has not been seen since. We won't see the movie tonight because there wasn't time to put that in. Next week we'll do Spreading the Message. That was done in many ways. That was done through newspaper, magazine, books, classes, schools, training schools, centers in the field, and most importantly, silent unity. Excuse me. The next week, we will talk about the value of covenants. We will talk about the spiritual practices. Very important, because those are things that we can all adopt to revitalize the movement from within ourselves. The fruits of the movement, of course, a worldwide healing ministry, both local healing, one-on-one healing at 9th and Tracy, as well as silent unity, both in the field and at the headquarters. And after that, maintaining the legacy. And I would so appreciate if, in the meantime, before we get to that lesson, if you would all start thinking about what you would like to covenant in terms of what kinds of spiritual practices, what can you do to contribute to revitalizing a healing ministry. We were commissioned to heal. Jesus gave us that commission. We can do it. The Fillmores did it. They were not exceptional in the sense of having more abilities than we do, but they did have exceptional faith and courage and perseverance. Frank Judici said, 2 ordinary people with health problems. He compared their ministry to the tower at Unity Village. You know, that tower that just kind of appears out of a flat piece of land. And he said these 2 ordinary people, out of their healing challenges, used that challenge to build this incredible healing ministry that stretched around the world. And I would like to spend some time talking about the direction, the standards that were set by the Fillmores. There was standards for teaching, standards for administration, standards for how you conduct classes, standards for silent unity. For every single department, there were standards that were always aligned with principles of truth. Eternal, non-changing truth. And so we can challenge ourselves by saying, how do we fit in to this picture? Since I assume that if you are watching this broadcast, you are a truth student in unity. If not, that's all right, because this is a universal teaching. And so I have put 2 dates on the board this evening, because those are the only 2 dates that we're going to talk about tonight. As you may know, 1886, that was the inside beginning of unity. The official date for the starting of unity was April 1889, but as you know, it happens inside first. 1886 is when Dr. Eugene B. Weeks came to Kansas City and gave a lecture. As a result of that lecture, Charles and Myrtle both went to it. Myrtle was inspired. Charles was not. But for both of them, it was the moment when unity began. What is so amazing about that lecture, not that Myrtle Fillmore was healed of tuberculosis, the body heals itself. What is extraordinary is that she went in to a lecture believing that she was going to die. The doctors had told her within 3 months of an incurable disease that she had inherited from her family. 4 members of her family had already died, and she left that lecture knowing that she was a child of God, a spiritual being. She could inherit only good, that there was no such thing as an incurable disease, and life was eternal. That is a 180-degree turnaround in thinking, that for most of us to make that kind of change would take, a lifetime or 2 or 3. We're all working on it. We are all called to do that, to know the truth about ourselves and then bring our thinking and our decisions and our attitudes and our actions in line with that truth. And we're all working on that. But Myrtle, and sometimes when we are very inspired, we can go to a lecture and be very inspired and say, wow, that was really great. And wait until the next inspiring teacher comes along. Not Myrtle. She took that truth, I am a child of God, and therefore I do not inherit sickness. She left that lecture. She went home. She threw away her medicines. She accepted no help from Christian Science practitioners because she knew this was something she was going to be sharing, and she wanted to try it on her own. And she immediately set up a daily routine so that she could really incorporate that truth into her being. Her routine went like this. 2 hours every morning she spent in the silence. There was an empty chair that was for Jesus, who reminded her of her Christ self. She studied the scripture, in particular, not just all the healing encounters that you find in the New Testament and Old Testament, but the I am statements in the Gospel of John. It is said, the Fillmores believed, that the secret of Jesus' success was his identification with the Christ within. Okay? I and the Father are one. And so Myrtle worked with these I am statements. These are statements that are true only on the level of experience in the silence. If you were out and about doing your errands and you said to someone, I am the resurrection and the life, they might wonder if you were, in your right mind. But in the silence of your being, you know that that is the revitalizing principle that allows you to be resurrected and lifted and restored and renewed. I am, the I of you, can never be sick, can never die, can never be poor, or any of those things that we think about in human consciousness. So I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. The I of me is the good shepherd. That is my guidance. That Christ is my guidance. All right. And all those I am statements she used. And then another handout here. This is something that she put by her bed and recited this every evening. I am health, peace, happiness, and prosperity. The Spirit of God, who is active in me, flows through my body in a purifying, cleansing, healing stream that removes all obstructions and brings peace, health, and harmony to my body. I am well, strong, and vital. I am beautiful, peaceful, and poised. I am eternally youthful. I am buoyant, happy, free. I shall rise in the morning filled with energy, radiance, and the power to accomplish. It's a good thing to have next to you as you go to sleep. And it took 2 years for her to fully incorporate that truth into her mind and body. But she never looked back. She was never ill again. And when she made her transition, it was a choice. She knew her work was now accomplished on this plane and that she could do better work on the other side. One asks oneself, what is it that brought about that rapid change? An almost unbelievable change in an instant like that. And so I did some biographical searching and found that actually, even as a child, she was a mystic. She would have these experiences of being out of her body, being one with nature, and realizing that in that timeless zone, she was free from pain. She already had tuberculosis as a child, and it was painful. And then when she would come back, she would be aware of the pain again. And then she would think of how it felt to be free from that pain, and then she was free from pain. All right. I'll just read you this passage from, and this is from Myrtle Fillmore, Mother of Unity. All right. There was a place, a grove of trees alongside of a creek in back of her house. And she would lie down there under the trees and put her hands under her head with her face turned skyward. And soon she wasn't there at all. No, she would be way up among the fleecy, changeful, melting clouds. She would be among the swaying branches of the green trees, among the birds that sung and soared, among whatever there was up there to be among. Somehow she would seem to be one with all that was. Then suddenly her soul and body would be reunited, and she would be aware that the process had taken place. This is a description of a transcendent moment, that you're not aware that it is an experience until after you come out of it and you say, oh, what was that? She wondered how she got out of her body and how she got back in, and why she could not always be up there, mingling with it all. When she thought about her body and how it was so often filled with pain, the trees, the birds, and the clouds would seem to lift themselves away from her. And she would feel all lonely and shut in. But when she thought of herself as free from her body, and how she was both without and within it, and how she was undoubtedly one with the all, sharing life with all things living, sharing beauty with all things beautiful, sharing joy with all things joyful, how glad and happy and how free she became. And then her soul soared again, free and unfettered, and she consciously blended herself into the one. That's a child mystic. She was a mere child. Just prior to that passage, there is a description of how she would get up at sunrise and go and greet the sun and kiss the sun. So it was, she knew her oneness with nature, and it was only after she had grown up and had words to put to that experience that she said she knew the omnipresence of God. And spiritually, that's how we would describe that experience. I'd like to also read to you a few comments by others who knew her, and this kind of ethereal quality that she had, a very light presence. All right. Ernest Wilson. You know, Ernest Wilson was the second Unity minister after the Fillmores left Ninth and Tracy. Ernest Wilson became the minister, so he knew them. It says, he perceived, this is Ernest Wilson, perceived in Myrtle something that enabled her to go deeper, get beneath the surface, and see beyond what others saw. She seemed to live in a different world from most of us, a world of expanded perception in which only a gesture or a verbal hint would be sufficient to establish effective communication. He was alluding to the world of mystical union with God, to which Myrtle seemed to have access. Passages in her letters reveal a deep inner connection with the divine. She herself, in replying to one of those early letters, and this is in the healing letters, she said, she called these experiences her mountaintop days. Moments when you contact spirit so closely that you really feel one with the omnipotent, loving Father. These are precious moments indeed. These are the moments which give us courage to come back to our daily tasks and to meet them with the strength we have gained through close communion with the Father. And then this one, this is a very powerful one. She says, I have come so close to breaking through into the wonderful things of the kingdom. And at times I seem most bursting with beautiful, powerful realities that I would have humanity see and radiate and realize. But these great inspirations and surges of power don't seem to put themselves into words, and I can but radiate them. I feel inseparably one with the presence of all that is good and desirable at all times. I think my part must be just to be and to build and to behold these things, to enable others to touch them as they think of me and yearn for what I represent to them. An amazing thing that she saw herself as a teacher of this truth of oneness by example, and that she had to just be this, and when people would be around her or when people would think of her and what she represented, they would be there with her. An amazing prediction of the kind of teacher she was. She says further, she was convinced that a leader must have a dynamic spiritual consciousness which will serve as an irresistible magnet to attract other souls. And she suggests that all consistent students should practice the principles and not dissipate their substance through dabbling in every teaching that comes along. Ooh, she would not like what she sees today. The New Age buffet. One may have an understanding, yet in everyday living may diverge from our ideas. Oh, yes. Doesn't that ring true for us, that we know what the principles are, we understand how it works, and yet there's this irresistible urge to be attracted to these outer things. So that's Myrtle. Now, there is a little booklet, and it's called How I Found Health. It has been in continuous print ever since it was written. And this is one of the handouts that I have given to all those present in my classes. But she has this realization as she is healing. And she's looking at, she's thinking about how we communicate, not just with each other, but how we communicate with animals, how we communicate with life. How do we know our oneness with all life? And she says this. She said, I was thinking about life. Life is everywhere, in animals and in people. Then why doesn't the life in the animal make a body like a human's? I asked. Then I thought the animal has not as much sense as a human. Intelligence as well as life is needed to make a body. Here is the key to my discovery. Life has to be guided by intelligence in making all forms. The same law works in my own body. Life is simply a form of energy, and it has to be guided and directed in a person's body by his or her intelligence. How do we communicate intelligence? By thinking and talking, of course. Then it flashed upon me that I might talk to the life in every part of my body and have it do just what I wanted. I began to teach my body and got marvelous results. It's a good technique that when you realize that every cell in your body is alive with energy and intelligence, you speak to it and it responds to you. You can do this with plants, you can do this with animals, and I have to share with you a story that I heard on the radio day before yesterday. You know, if you ever doubted that animals had intelligence, this will be a heartwarming story for you. A man who was the only survivor, who had jumped off of the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. The only one. This happened 14 years ago, and he was being interviewed on the radio day before yesterday, and he said that it wasn't any situational thing that made him jump, and he had this mental illness, and he had these voices inside that were saying that he needed to die. And so he jumped. And he said as soon as he left the bridge, he started to pray. He said he knew he had made a mistake and he wanted to live. And so it was, please save me. I don't know the exact words of his prayer. And in the free fall, his discs exploded in his back, some of them. He hit the water, went down 700 feet or so, came up and found that because of the discs in his back that it was hard for him to move. He couldn't move his legs, actually, and he needed to stay afloat. And, all the while praying that he wanted to live. And he felt this creature brush up against him. It was a sea lion who kept him afloat until the Coast Guard came. It was an amazing story. I almost stopped the car just to marvel at this. He said later he did a little research and found that that was such a common thing for animals to know when you are in distress. This man had angels watching over him. A woman who had been crossing the bridge saw him jump, called someone that she knew in the Coast Guard, and so the Coast Guard was there in 12 minutes, and he was saved. And he now does suicide prevention. But here's the end of the story, that a year later, his father said, "You need to make some closure with this." And he took him back to the Golden Gate Bridge and told him to pick a flower and to throw it into the ocean, which he did. And as soon as that flower hit the water, a sea lion popped up. Amazing. Every part of creation serves God's purpose. Never discount the animals, the plants. If we truly knew that we are whole, which is the reason we can heal, we're already whole, we simply have to remove the blocks to that awareness, and then it would be impossible for us to be cruel to animals. It would be impossible for us to pollute our waters and our air. We are this environment. We have projected our consciousness outward and created an environment, and we then find ourselves victims of our own conditions. An amazing story. I shall always remember the sea lions. And he will too. And there are other creatures like that. It doesn't matter if it's the same species, that there are, creatures that we think are not friendly to one another that help one another out. I can't think of a specific story right now, but I know I've read about them. And so Myrtle knew a truth right from the beginning, that when when you are one with your Christ self within, in that moment in the silence, it may just be a flash, but as you go there more and more often, that awareness of God's presence expands, and you grow in your awareness of the wholeness that you are. Health is not the absence of sickness. Wholeness, health, is the fullness of that infinite potential. So we just think of health as something physical, but it's something spiritual, and it comes from the word holos, or wholeness. I got my PhD from Holos University, that wholeness of life. And so that's what our practice of the silence brings to our awareness, that we are whole. There's a part of us that is whole no matter what the body is going through. There is a part of us that is always abundant. We are always, that source is always there, active and lively. And so we have, what do you see out there? Oh, okay. All right. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Myrtle's background, because she said after that lecture that she was ready soil. There was something about her background and her consciousness that was fertile soil for that new truth that penetrated her soul so deeply that she never doubted or looked back. And so, in looking at her upbringing, there were those mystical experiences that I've already told you about. Her family she was from Pagetown, Ohio. And by the way, her name was not Myrtle, it was Mary Carolyn Page. Myrtle was a nickname that stuck. Her mother was a very loving person, and her father, obviously the town was named after Pagetown, so he was the postmaster and a farmer and a civic leader in that town. They were Methodists, very strict Methodists. Myrtle was never able to accept the theology of Methodism. She thought, how can my loving mother believe in a stern God that punishes and makes people die? And so she was very selective as to what she took in. But she was passionate about nature, she was passionate about books, and she was passionate about what she called dear Christ, that God within her. She did have an education, and in those days, girls were not allowed to have the same education as boys. They were believed to be incompetent. However, she had brothers, and they got to read all the good books, and so she did a lot of reading. She'd just take her brother's books and go and read, and that included, the classics, Shakespeare, the Bible, all the philosophy. She read all of that, and then she went to the kind of college that women went to, a 2-year college, where it was just a sort of a superficial, maybe not so superficial, literary education. Anyway, and so that's how she grew up. Now, Charles Fillmore, let's talk a little about Charles, because he went to that same lecture and he was totally disinterested. He was not impressed at all. But he was very impressed with Myrtle and the progress that he noticed. How could he help but notice her healing process? And he noticed how she worked well with others, and she was able to, even in those days before she announced that she was completely healed, she was working with people around her and having success with them. Not just little things. It was a blind child who could see, a man with crutches who, she said, put down those crutches and walk. It sounds a little bit like Jesus. But Charles, he noticed this. And so as it turned out, 1886 was a real turning point for him, because he had an opposite background. It was kind of a rough existence. He was born on an Indian reservation. He was kidnapped by the Sioux and kept away from his mother for a day. His father left home when he was 7. He had one brother. His schooling was interrupted by a skating accident, misdiagnosed, mistreated, and developed into tuberculosis of the hip. And he wound up with one leg, I think it was 4 inches shorter than the other, and was in extreme pain. And he couldn't walk except with crutches. Eventually he had a shoe that made his legs even. And his mother, here was his mother left alone in the wild. She was a dressmaker to raise these 2 kids. And he went to work for a printer's, he was a printer's assistant, which is where he first got some knowledge of printing, which served him later. And at a certain age, and I'm not quite sure what it was, but something like 18, he left home and promised that once he got settled, he would bring his mother down. And he went to a bunch of places, but ended up in Denton, Texas, where we don't know a whole lot about his time there, except that with Myrtle's influence, that's where Myrtle met him, in Denton, Texas, where she went because the climate was easier for her than it was in Clinton, Iowa. And so they met at a literary club. And interestingly, Charles had a tutor who had been to the same college that Myrtle had been. And so they shared that literary interest. Charles did everything under the sun. At the time, he was a freight clerk at the railway. But after a year, and with Myrtle's influence, he joined the Temperance Society. The headlines read, "Charles Fillmore on the wagon." Apparently he was the town drunk. And so after a year, Myrtle started a school. And it was such a good school that the parents wanted her to give them a class so that they could continue this school for their children. Right? Charles went off to do metal assaying, and then went on to do real estate. Meanwhile, Myrtle went back to Clinton, Missouri, excuse me. Clinton, Missouri, where she took a teaching job. And they corresponded. And one of the funny letters that she wrote to Charles was how she had been to a church service. And it was an outdoor church service. And she described the whole setting with mosses and trees and rocks and water flowing over the rocks. And she said most of the people were listening to the preacher, who was pretty boring, while she was communing with nature. And so they married. And it's an interesting story because she was kind of a pioneer wife when they married, and he took her off to Colorado, and it was quite a dangerous existence in those days. But Charles had no religious upbringing. He did not believe in Jesus Christ. So who knew that with that kind of background, that he would come along with Myrtle to dedicate his entire life to spiritual teaching together. And he wrote books. I have a list of all of the books he wrote. He wrote and published magazines. And I mean, he had no formal schooling, and yet he turned out all of these books, which were really collections of essays, transcriptions of talks. He quit his real estate job in order to devote his life to that, to spreading the teachings of truth. So that 1886 lecture was a transformational point for him as well. I also put 1892 because, and this is included in your packet, here's a list, 12 books. I don't know if you have one of these, Linda, but you can have this one if you don't. I've got a lot of them. And in 1892, Charles and Myrtle made a covenant. And I'd just like to take a few minutes to talk about the importance of a covenant. Here's how this covenant reads. We, Charles Fillmore and Myrtle Fillmore, husband and wife, hereby dedicate ourselves, our time, our money, all we have, and all we expect to have, to the Spirit of Truth, and through it to the Society of Silent Unity. It being understood, and, this is hard to read, agreed, that the said Spirit of Truth shall render unto us an equivalent for this dedication in peace of mind, health of body, wisdom, understanding, love of life, and an abundant supply of all things necessary to meet every want, without our making any of these things the object of our existence. In the presence of the conscious mind of Christ Jesus, this 7th day of December, 1892. All right, that is what you call a total commitment. Do we make that kind of commitment to our own spiritual life? Do we even make a commitment to our practice of silence? That would be a start, yes. Or to spiritual study, a portion each day. Well, they made this total commitment, trusting that they were doing God's work, and so what they needed to continue this would be given to them, but it was never for profit. It was just, they would get what they needed to do this work and to keep it going, but none of that being the object of their existence. Covenants are important because you're much less likely to break your word to yourself if you have a covenant. You know, if you say, well, I'm going to start exercising and eating good food and you have all these things that you think are going to make your life better, and then you say, oh, well, I don't have time today. Right? But if you've made a covenant, you're making that covenant with the God part of yourself. And so you're much less likely to break that. Covenant is a very good tool. We'll continue talking, but I want to take this break to let you know that there's a phone number here. If you would like to call in, 816-301-6304. 816-301-6304. Now, it all started in 1886. The covenant was in 1892. The first Modern Thought magazine, it actually is in the form of a newspaper, and that's a handout that I have and that you may have. You can get one from me, Linda. And from there, Modern Thought went through a number of name changes and became Unity Magazine and became the spokes, the means of spreading silent unity. And so that was used for teaching people. It was a ministry that blossomed and spread like unbelievably through all parts of the world. Just with the local healing alone, Myrtle first worked with people in her neighborhood. Word got out, and people started coming from Kansas City, all over Kansas City. And then, as a result of the testimonials that would appear, people started coming from all over the United States, and eventually she had international people. Throughout their ministry, Myrtle continued to work one-on-one with people, whereas Charles favored the silent unity, which they called the absent healing. In a newspaper article that appeared in a weekly unity in the year 1924, a woman wrote, who had herself been down to Ninth and Tracy and received a healing with myrtle. She said that Ninth and Tracy was the greatest healing center in the world. We don't hear a lot about that. The 1920s was really the golden years of unity when it reached its highest point. Charles had gifts, unique gifts. He was an organizer. He would say, and I think he probably believed this, that he was the reincarnation of Paul. And in terms of building, an organization, building structures, that is probably true. And of course, Charles's favorite passages in the Bible: Christ in you, your hope of glory. That's from Paul. Right? I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. That's from Paul. Be ye transformed by the renewal of your mind. Romans, right? That's from Paul. And so you knew that he was pretty steeped in all parts of the Bible, but he seemed to find an affinity with Paul's life and Paul's teachings. So who knows? Who knows? But he was a great organizer. And it's interesting that Myrtle's role just seemed to radiate the truth that she lived. And Charles was to build the structures, to write the books, although Myrtle wrote a book as well, but to write the books and to hold the vision of the greatest possibilities for what started as something very small. Amazing to go from not being a believer in Jesus Christ to having a vision that through silent unity all around the world, these little groups, that he could see the possibility of world peace with people sitting together in the silence that would bring that about simply by radiating the consciousness of what he called the universal church of Christ. Unity, church, universal, an invisible church of Christ in which there was a shared vision and a shared silence. After all, it is in the silence where you know your oneness. 816-301-6304. If you have questions or comments, please give a call. Also, like for next week, we're going to talk about the publications as a means of spreading the teaching. I do have lots of wee wisdoms that you may have. Just send me a love offering for the postage, and I'd be happy to send you some. And each one of these publications, amazingly, had a purpose. And Charles had the grand purpose: redeem the entire human race. All right? Unity Magazine was going to redeem the entire human race. He could see from this one practice in the silence the possibility of regeneration. For me, personally, I have been looking ever since I knew Charles's story, I have been looking for what it was that got him into the silence. Myrtle just kind of slipped into it, as she was a child, and she had very she didn't have strong boundaries. She just kind of floated off into the absolute. But Charles, had no interest in truth. So how did he get to the silence? Well, he was inspired by Myrtle, and he studied. He thought, if she can do it, I can do it too. And he studied everything, every philosophy, every religion, and somehow said, it's too much. I'm going to go to headquarters. Well, this happened last week. This was an epiphany that finally, because Charles said he would just sit in the silence for, I think it was 4 months, just like through sheer determination to sit there. And finally, after no results, he started having dreams. And he did have a dream that his work was to be in Kansas City. He had that insight. And I thought, you cannot will yourself into the silence. He had no teachers. How did he do that? I, having taught this silent meditation for 40 years, and I found it. It's in May 1924, Unity magazine. I found that in his studies, he had come across what he called the easiest way to enter the silence. Now, he called it concentration, but he explained that concentration in the East did not mean like I'm concentrating on this. Okay. Concentration is that all the fragments of consciousness become concentrated as you go in and approach the source. Oh, and he described mantras. He said that the mantras, which is something that I recognized on my own, but to hear Charles Fillmore say this was like a nice validation for me, that all the mantras are variations of the name of God. And what's the name of God? I am. Okay. Very interesting statement. And that's what he says is going to regenerate the whole human race. We all have a chance to participate in that, but we have to begin with ourselves and a practice in the silence. So I'm not expecting to get a lot of phone calls tonight, since my two main callers are not online. But is there anything that you would like to ask, to comment upon, or anything that you understand now about Unity history than before? Yeah, you. Yeah, I'll ask you first since you're here. That's no pressure on you.
I just find it amazing that she, like when you, she kept copies of all the letters that she wrote people. Wow.
Yes, and in the archives, there is a book called Healing Letters. Somebody took what they thought was, the kind of the cream of the letters and published them in this little book called Healing Letters. But in the archives, there are hundreds and hundreds of letters that she wrote personally in response. She always felt it important to deal with the one-on-one. And she knew how to make that connection. Whereas, and Charles has a point too, that the kind of healing that comes from if somebody calls in on the phone, and the telephone prayer ministry began in 1907. If someone calls in, it's just a voice. You don't see them, they don't see you. They have a story, they have some difficulty, and you speak truth to them. And so he felt that having it be impersonal was more effective. Whereas even when Silent Unity moved to the next door building at 9th and Tracy, that building which no longer exists, Myrtle kept her office at 913, which is still there on the 3rd floor, because Silent Unity was not open to the public, so she kept her office on the 3rd floor where she could still meet one-on-one with people in need of healing. And by then, she had 11 more ladies to work with her, and the halls would be lined on Sunday after a standing room only service. Waiting, and the auditorium holds 585 people, and there would be hundreds lining the halls waiting for healing. I think of this every Sunday as I look out over a mostly empty auditorium into the halls and think of what that might have been like back 100 years ago.
It would have been overwhelming, I think.
And it's like barely out of the Victorian age, and it was hugely successful. Charles and Myrtle did the greater works that Jesus promised. And I don't hear anybody talking about that today. I was at a Unity convention just a couple of weeks ago, and a number of people were speaking, and a frequent comment was, "I love Unity." And I could tell by the context that some of them were talking about an organization, and some of them were talking about a school, and some of them were talking about a church. But I didn't hear anyone talk about how they loved the Unity teaching, which not only produced the healing, but which allowed every one of us to do the greater works, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to cast out the demons. And Charles and Myrtle totally believed it, and they did it. And they left that legacy for us. And now Unity, the teachings of Unity, are eternal truth. It will never die. But the form through which that teaching comes, that's up to whichever form is most compatible for that truth to live in. So it's something for all of us to think about. So it's amazing that from this simple practice of silence comes that vision of infinite possibilities. Infinite possibilities. And Charles caught that. Myrtle had that mystical experience, and he did too. He was a mystic too. there's a film, and if I can get the technology going here, I will play the film Charles Fillmore, American Mystic. And I think you've probably seen The View and the Vision. That one is impressive because it's silent. In 1926, Charles called in Hollywood to, he always had the best equipment. He always got the best. He understood prosperity principles. He didn't skimp on equipment or materials in any way. And he called in Hollywood and said, we want to show the world what goes on a day at Unity. And what you see is the obvious focus and joy of working together, all participating in every various possible way in sustaining this incredible vision of the redemption of the entire human race. I haven't heard people speak in such big terms since I heard the spiritual regeneration movement, the object of world peace. And so back in 1959, which is obviously, a precursor to, I'm sorry, not a precursor. The Fillmores, what they discovered was a precursor to that. Anyway, that's what I intended to cover tonight, just how two very, very different people met together in an unusually compatible way to build that rock solid foundation of faith, more than faith, understanding faith, that allowed that skyscraper, that tower of a ministry to blossom forth in its fullest. So, once again, if you are out there, please give a call with your questions or comments, 816-301-6304. 816-301-6304. I will say one more thing before we close, and that is this is the 90th anniversary of the Daily Word, which was first put out in 1924. So I will just read this to you. I was going to read it next week, but I'll read it now. In adding another publication to the wealth of metaphysical literature published by Unity School, we do so to meet the insistent demand for a manual of daily studies. The teachings will be as absolute as is consistent in making truth clear to minds of various degrees of spiritual unfoldment. The power of the Word will be taught day by day. Let each reader consider that this magazine and its message are dedicated to him or her. We bless this little manual and consecrate it to the principle of truth, in the name and through the power of Jesus Christ. And so Charles, from not believing in Jesus Christ, began every class with Jesus Christ is in charge of this class. Jesus Christ is in charge of this meeting. Jesus Christ is the only head of our school. It wasn't all that long ago when we were not allowed to use that term. But we do, once again. And so I'll invite you to close your eyes. I'll take an affirmation from here. So let's take a moment and just have a moment of silence and feel the substance of these words as they flow through you. The peace of Christ is born to my consciousness. The peace of Christ is born to my consciousness. And in this affirmation, the quote is from Christian Healing, that a Messiah or Christ man would be born in their midst. The Christ man, or perfect idea of God mind, is now being expressed and demonstrated by men and women. And so in the silence, we are at peace. And we say, thank you. Amen. My favorite quote from Charles Fillmore is, "The truth you know is the truth you use, and all the rest is theory." So the practical part of Christianity, let us remember that we are given this truth to practice it and to serve and to uplift consciousness. And so that's it for tonight. So for those of you at home, I invite you to hold your love offering in your hands and know that in giving your gift, you are supporting the new foundation in unity. We acknowledge that there is one source, one infinite source, one substance that we have access to at all times. Everything we could ever need, require, or desire is present in that one source, waiting to express in and through us as our prosperity. Recognizing that one source, we give freely and with love, knowing that we cannot outgive God, and already more good is on its way to us. And as we send our gifts forth, we bless them with our offertory statement, "Divine love through me blesses and multiplies all the good I give and all the good I receive." Thank you, God. And so, thank you for participating this evening. We will continue next week, Thursday, same time, and we will continue with our inside story of the unity movement. Thank you, God bless you, and have a wonderful evening.